Okay, we'll go live on 3, 2, 1.
Good evening. I'm Helen Bryan, Chairman of the Board for Masters Leadership Alumni Association. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight is the first program of our education series that will address a topic that is near and dear to all of us, the Alamo. This program was originally scheduled for last March, but unfortunately, due to COVID, we were unable to meet. So thanks to Deco 37, our production company, we can bring this program to you. And for those of you that are curious about our setup tonight, our speakers, our moderator, Sue Copeland, and myself are all at a COVID-certified studio, which means that they adhere to stringent protocols, keeping everything sterile and everyone a minimum of 6 feet apart. So until we can meet again in person, this will be our new norm, allowing us to maintain our number one priority of keeping our members, our guests, and our speakers safe. I look forward to seeing everyone on November the 5th at the same time and the same place for a conversation with former Air Force Chief of Staff, General David Goldfein. Now, I will turn the evening over to our moderator, Sue Copeland, to introduce our speakers and get tonight's event going. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Sue Copeland, proud member of Class 3. Before I introduced our two speakers, I wanted to thank Mary Steffel, a Class 10 MLP graduate, who initially put this program together back in March. It had to be canceled because of the virus, but she shared her efforts with me, and I just picked up where she left off. Thank you very much, Mary. At any time during the program, if you have a question for our two speakers, just type it in and send it to us. It'll show up on the right side of the screen, and it'll say top chat. So just type it in, send it at any time. It's live streamed, so we'll get it and try to get to it. Thank you very much. We are so fortunate to have two people speaking to us today who have extensive knowledge about what's going on at the Alamo, past, present, and future. Our first speaker is Roberto Trevino, San Antonio City Councilman for District 1. Councilman Trevino is a native of McAllen, Texas, where he grew up and graduated from Memorial High School. He left for Lubbock to obtain his bachelor's degree of architecture from Texas Tech University and subsequently earned his MBA from the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech. He then moved to San Antonio, became a registered architect, and began his professional career. As he became more established in his career, he began to spend more time serving on nonprofit boards and citizen committees, and in 2014, he was asked to apply for the interim city council district seat number 1, for which he was unanimously approved. The list of his accomplishments would fill several sheets of paper, but the quote from his biography that best describes his role in District 1 is citizen architect. He has used this approach in how he serves the needs not only of his district, but of San Antonio as a whole. In 2017, Mayor Ron Nuremberg selected Councilman Trevino to chair the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Committee. He also serves on the Bear Appraisal Board, the Alamo Citizen Advisory Board, and the Alamo Management Committee. I'm looking forward to him quoting some movie lines during his talk today, especially if they are from a galaxy far, far away. I understand he is a big Star Wars fan, so may the force be with you, Councilman Trevino. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm truly proud to be here today and to be alongside somebody like Christy Nichols here to talk about one of the most well-known and well-recognized subjects for San Antonio, which is the Alamo. As you know, I'm on the management committee. I'm the chairman of the Alamo Management Committee, one of the tri-chairs of the Citizens Advisory Committee, and I've also been a part of City Council since 2014, when the Citizens Advisory Committee essentially started this current effort to tell the stories at the Alamo. What we established with the Citizens Advisory Committee was what's called the Alamo Vision and Guiding Principles. For those of you that would like to read what those vision and guiding principles are, you can simply Google that and City of San Antonio, and a PDF will show up on your screen. I encourage you to read those words. Every single word was discussed. It was a very, very thoughtful document, and basically lays out the path that we set upon to try to create a world-class project, a project that was worthy of the Alamo. In those vision and guiding principles, one of the most important aspects of that was to tell a complete story. We know, I think a lot of people know, the 13-day battle story of the Alamo. But it has unfortunately been something that has only seen a very narrow view. So telling that story, that broad story, was very important to the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee and to all our partners. So soon after we created the vision and guiding principles, the General Land Office and the Alamo Foundation came to the City of San Antonio to form a partnership, a tri-party partnership to create a grand vision, a huge project that adopted the vision and guiding principles at its heart. And so the General Land Office, known as the State of Texas, and the Foundation agreed to partner with the City of San Antonio, and we created the Management Committee, which is made up of 2 members from the City of San Antonio, myself and the City Manager, Eric Walsh. It used to be Cheryl Scully, and a big shout out to Cheryl Scully for all her great work on that committee. And then, of course, 2 from the General Land Office. Currently, we have Hector Valle and Jeff Gordon representing the General Land Office. The Alamo Foundation had Ramona Bass and Gene Powell. Gene Powell has stepped off in March. We now have Congressman Will Hurd representing that part of the committee. Beneath the Alamo Management Committee is the Citizens Advisory Committee, made up of about 21 members in our community. They represent a diverse section of our community. Some of them are appointed by city council members, others are appointed by the state of Texas, and others are appointed by certain sections that we designated through the contract. And then at the top of the whole organizational chart is the executive committee, which is the mayor of San Antonio, Ron Nirenberg, and the General Land Office Commissioner George P. Bush, that basically have essentially veto power at the very top of everything that we do to try to move this project forward. As I mentioned, this project started in 2014, but in 2015, when we established that committee, we began the long process of creating the design that reflected those principles. As the best way I can describe that design is basically in 3 parts: is making sure that we restore the church and the long barracks. Those are some of the most significant artifacts we have visible on site. We know we have some artifacts that are not visible, and you'll hear more about that from Christy Nichols, I'm sure. But the first aspect of this project is to make sure that those buildings are in good shape. When we study the buildings, we learned that they are essentially buildings that need a lot of help, a lot of work to make sure that they last for another 100+ years. The second part of the project is about the plaza itself, Alamo Plaza as we know it, and it includes Alamo Street. It includes the historic Mission footprint and the plaza to the south. So we call that all Alamo Plaza. And of course, in the vision and guiding principles, one of the most important aspects we talked about, the tangible aspects, was to recapture the space that we know is the historic footprint, and that is Alamo Mission Plaza. And then the last piece of the project entailed creating a world-class museum. That museum would house all the collections, would tell the stories of the Alamo, would bear the responsibility of teaching future generations of the incredible stories that happen at the Alamo. So that essentially is the charge of the Alamo Management Committee, the Citizens Advisory Committee, and ultimately all those that are involved, including the executive committee members, the city council, and all the folks that we went through to introduce this grand vision. As part of this, we went through different iterations of the project, introduced different elements. We've made several compromises so that we can tell a complete story. At the plaza, one of the biggest and most important aspects of telling that story was to tell that complete story through what they called a site neutral setting, and being able to express different eras. So this is a 300-year plus history of the Alamo, and so having the ability to have a plaza that did not have something that was about one period in time or one narrow period in time was very important, which is why the recommendation to move the cenotaph 500 feet to the south was made and part of this project. There's also a recommendation to lower the site approximately to the original level of the site back in 1836, or when the mission itself was built. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important for many reasons. One of them was to help delineate the actual site itself and to mark the space of where the original mission footprint was. Of course, the city has grown up over time, and so the elevation from that time to today is very different. We've built roads over it. We've built buildings over it, and so in that time period, it exists about 19 to 24 inches below grade. But it's also important because building up all that dirt over the buildings has caused a lot of problems for the buildings. The buildings themselves are wicking moisture. And if you were to do this, let's say at your home, you'd experience a lot of similar issues, which is you're essentially created a moisture problem that over time would deteriorate your building. And so the master planners have all described the buildings as sick and that they need this treatment. And so that was part of the effort of making sure that we go back to the original elevation so that people can see exactly what elevation the building really was located at. In fact, if you visited the church, one of the first things you notice is that the doors seem to be really low, and you probably tell yourself, wow, I guess people were pretty short when they built this. And in fact, they were actually much higher because the ground itself, or the floor, has come up significantly. And so when we lower the floor to its original elevation or its proper elevation, those doors would not seem so low. So those are some examples of the kinds of things that we need to do. But most importantly, we know that we need to tell a complete story, an evidence-based approach to telling history. And there's so much that the Alamo is teaching us. There's so much that the Alamo is helping us to organize. One thing that most people don't expect that the Alamo has done for the city of San Antonio is it's helped us organize a lot of our commercial parking around the area. We learned that as we've organized a better framework for how things should be around that area, we learned that a lot of the commercial parking zones were not actually documented, or most people didn't understand why they were located there. So we were able to do a broader study and organize that portion of downtown for better traffic flow and better commercial parking. But that's not the end of it. The reality is we're learning so much history, and we want to be very, very careful about how we tell the stories at the Alamo, from the periods that existed before the mission itself, the indigenous periods, to the colonial periods, the mission era, and of course up to the battle that describes the influence of slavery that talks about how Mexico has long seen and represents this history, at least the way they interpret the history of the Alamo, and have never felt that the complete story has never been told. And of course, modern day San Antonio, including the civil rights story. Tomorrow we'll be releasing some great information about the studies that we had as a management committee procured regarding the Woolworth building, its architectural history, along with its civil rights history. And what we feel very, very strongly about is that we will approach everything very thoughtfully and through an evidence-based data approach, so that when we tell a story at the Alamo, we know it's accurate, we know it is the right story to tell, and it is teaching history in the best way possible. That's been the goal of our project. We intend to move forward in that way. Of course, we know that lately we hit a road bump with the Texas Historical Commission and their denial to relocate the cenotaph. We are regrouping and trying to find a path forward that, again, puts telling a complete story at the heart and as a priority for what we do. What I can say is that the Management Committee and the Citizens Advisory Committee, along with our City Council, will not succumb to political pressure to tell that history. History will be told through an evidence-based approach and through our experts that will allow us to really reveal all the layers of history, all the 300 years plus that we know exists there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Trevino. That was very good. Our next speaker is Christy Nichols. Christy is the archaeologist and collections manager for the Alamo Trust. She is originally from San Jose, California, but moved to San Antonio when she was in middle school. She graduated from Incarnate Word High School and went on to receive her undergraduate degree in archaeology at the University of San Diego in 2004 and obtained her master's degree in anthropology from UTSA. For almost 16 years, she was an archaeologist at the Center for Archaeological Research at UTSA. She has over 20 years of experience in the field of archaeology in Texas, with a focus on the Spanish colonial missions of the San Antonio River Basin, and has taught a UTSA field school on the grounds of the Alamo. Christy joined the Alamo Trust in the fall of 2018 and works with the archaeological consultants to aid in the interaction and communication with the Texas Historical Commission, as well as other project stakeholders. She oversees the collections team, manages the museum collection, as well as oversees the archaeological investigations taking place within the Alamo complex. As if that weren't enough, Christy and her husband have 4 daughters and a 14-year-old miniature schnauzer to complete the family. We are so lucky to have Christy give us time from her busy schedule to dig up some more dirt on the Alamo. Thanks for coming, Christy. Sorry about the pun.
No, I love it. That's awesome. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I do want to say that this is also an important talk that I'm going to be giving tonight, because not only are we going to be discussing the Alamo, which is a great site to discuss a lot of the archaeology on, but October is also Texas Archaeology Awareness Month, so we're getting a little bit of that tonight as well. So I'm going to go over a brief review of many of the archaeological projects that have occurred at what is originally known as Mission San Antonio de Valero, as we know it today is called the Alamo. If you see on my front screen, there should be a 41BX6 on there. That is the official trinomial that has been given to the site. It was the 6th site recorded in San Antonio in Bexar County when archaeology really started kicking off in San Antonio. Brief history on the site itself. In 1718, Mission San Antonio de Valero was established in San Antonio at the headwaters, or near the headwaters of the San Pedro Springs. realized real quickly that that was not a prime location for the mission. And after 2 moves, it finally arrived at the current site in 1724. A hurricane had destroyed a small stone structure that had been started kind of where the St. Joseph's Church is, where Joski's built up around it. We think may have been a second location until it finally moved to where it is today. So a lot of people do ask, did you move the Alamo to this site? And it moved originally, but it was not done any time during the modern time periods. I'm going to go to the next slide.
What slide is that?
Early excavations of the site. Just one moment. We're having slight technical difficulties, but we'll get there in a second. What's also interesting about this site, too, is actually one of the very first times that I met Councilman Trevino was as we were trying to find the potential first site of Mission San Antonio de Valero at this location of the Christopher Columbus Society and I think it's San Francisco de Paula Church.
That's right.
Worked with Kay Hines, the city archaeologist at that time, to investigate some colonial ceramics that had been coming out. So we're going to move back to the actual location, or the final location that we are at now of the Alamo. And what I wanted you guys all to know, that there's approximately, I would say 19 known excavations that have occurred at the site. If you consider what we have done within the past 2 years, we're bumping that up to about 20 to 21. And I'll talk about a little bit about that last work later in the presentation. What is interesting to understand is that archaeology was not formalized in San Antonio or even really in the nation until about the 1960s, when some regulations came into play to protect the nation's antiquities, including archaeological sites. So what we start seeing is in the late 1960s, actual formalized archaeological investigations taking place. And there are 2 locations, and where we do understand that there was some digging that happened prior to formalized archaeological investigations. And we get the information from newspaper articles during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Moving the slide. What I'm showing you guys right now is actually a map it's an aerial map that shows you an outline of what the Alamo compound would have looked like. Probably in the mid 1700s, and definitely very similar to what it would have looked like in 1836. If you notice, we have lots of different excavations that are keyed in on here, with the last one being an investigation that was a GPR survey. I do not have the latest ones on there, but I will be getting to that later in. What I did want to talk about on this outline is that the outline is actually a representation that has been developed by a man by the name of Jake Ivey, who is a historian and archaeologist. He used a lot of the archival records to determine where some of the outer walls of the compound are, and use some archaeology to help support that. A lot of people, when they come to visit the Alamo, walk up into the middle of the plaza and don't realize that they are standing in the center of the compound. So this just gives you an overview of what the site used to look like prior to modern times. Next slide. So the very first formal archaeological investigation occurred in 1966. And I think it was John Greer, decided that the first excavations they need to look at were inside the convento courtyard and the Calvary courtyard. The convento is another term for the area that would have been used by the priests during mission periods. Today, when you get into the convento courtyard, you can still walk around some of those areas, but we do not have all the structures that used to be there. He was looking to see if he can find any remnants of the mission period in there, and was surprised to find that there were still intact adobe floors as well as caliche floors that were used to pave the interior portion of the courtyard, as the priests use it for a reflection area. Shortly after that, one of our next investigations was conducted in the 1970s prior to the installation of the DRT library, which is now known as the Annex. If you come on site, you can come visit an exhibit in there. What was very interesting about that is that the 1970 investigations actually found a section of a Spanish colonial irrigation ditch that had been buried and lost to history at that point. The foundation of the building did interrupt it at that time, but we do still have remnants that you can interpret on site. Slide. On your screen, I've circled several investigations that we're going to be looking at now, starting in 1973. That year, there was 2 projects that were undertaken. One by the name of a man by the name of Tom Hester, and another one by a lady by the name of Marta Schutz. And they were in the northern portion of the Calvary courtyard, trying to kind of get an understanding. It is the slide that has circles on it.
Oh, that's the one we're on.
Yeah.
We're on the right one.
Yeah. Hester was able to find another portion of the Alamo acequia, which is that irrigation ditch, which was very fascinating to find because we had very few tidbits of information to know where it came through that back portion of the compound. And again, they were able to find remnants of this adobe and caliche floor. Schutz was able to find 4 rooms or remnants of 4 rooms that had been buried in the northern portion of the courtyard. And she was able to determine the distinction between the layers of what was mission period as well as what was related to the quartermaster depot. For those of you who do not know the entire history of the site, after the Battle of the Alamo and just prior to Texas being annexed to the United States, the U.S. military moved into the Alamo and used it as a warehouse. 1846 is when we have the first arrival. They turned that place into offices, barracks for their soldiers, as well as a warehouse to keep supplies to send all over Texas at the many forts that they had to keep. In 1975, there was a lot of landscaping that was going on in Alamo Plaza, and we as in the Center for Archaeological Research was in its very first years, was able to go out to the plaza and do a little bit of investigations just by observing what was going on. One of the biggest things is when you come downtown to visit right now and you go to the plaza, you'll notice that there are flagstones, that is the surface that you walk on. Those were installed in 1975 and 1976. And as they were being installed, there was some work that was done that the archaeologists could look at the dirt. The next few images I'm going to show you are some pictures from that time period that I was able to find in my new office when I moved to the Alamo that many people have not been able to see. What's also interesting too is that during this time period, a portion of the Lunette Trench, which was a 1836 or actually 1835 battle entrenchment that was created on the south side of the compound, was found during that, as well as a portion of the palisade, which connected from the southwest corner of the church all the way up to the low barrack. So what I'm going to talk about is a few of the artifacts that we found next. So if you go to the mission period slide, these very first excavations, a lot of the focus was trying to figure out what the mission period occupation looked like. On your slide, you'll see a lot of the different types of artifacts that we would have found related to the time period. We find that there's a continuation of Native American technologies from the people that were entering into the mission system. They were still using their tools that they had been using for centuries before that. And the Spanish priests were not able to get a lot of the supplies that they needed, so the Spanish priests would actually then incorporate the Native American technology into what they used every day. You'll notice that there is several things like bone awls, stone tools. There are small arrow points that we call the Guerrero points, as well as Native American pottery that we refer to as Goliad ware. These all would have been manufactured by the people entering into the mission system, and they continued on well throughout the entire mission period. Now, the other thing that we do see is we see the European influence coming into these missions at that time. If you look on the right-hand side of your slide, there's a section that shows some of the Spanish pottery that was being brought in from Mexico. We have pieces of lead glaze pottery that would have been like your big bowls that we'd use for serving and cooking. Some very fine decorated enamel wares that we call mahalikas. that are based off of Spanish traditions that were actually being produced in Mexico at that time and coming in. And then at the bottom, I believe we have some burnished ware, which is actually an unglazed pottery, but it's highly decorated with lots of different colors. We'll go to the next slide. The battle period artifacts are starting to come out of, yes, ma'am? Ah, okay. So as we were moving forward, we're trying to look at some of the other time periods of occupation, and one that everybody is very, very interested in is the battle period. During the 1977 investigations and part of that repaving, they were able to find some of the evidence of battle period artifacts that were coming out, as well as continuation of some of the mission period stuff. If you look on your slides now, you will see some of the battle-related artifacts in the form of many different sizes of musket balls, as well as a portion of a mortar. It's a broken piece that's at the bottom of one of those. Lots of different types of gun flints, musket fragments that we do find quite often. And I can't see what the other one is. Oh, a piece of a trigger guard. These are all fascinating artifacts that I will say are far and few between when we're doing the archaeology on site. And the reason is that there has been so much construction that has happened at the Alamo during the late 1900s all the way into the early 1900s that really just took out sections of the stratigraphy that were there. So when we do find objects like these, we're excited to be able to see what is related to the battle period. One of the recent excavation units that we had, we did find one piece of, it is a brass canister shot, which we have found that to be part of a canister shot that was the Mexican Army shooting at the Alamo. We're going to switch out. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Can you all hear me now? Okay.
Little one.
Okay. Let me see where we get back to here. Let's just go to the next slide then, and that should be good. Remember I told you that you're going to see some photographs that probably most people have not seen. Once this slide changes, you'll be able to see some photographs of the actual repaving of Alamo Plaza during 1976. What was very fascinating about this is when they took up the asphalt that was currently on the ground in the street, it revealed intact mesquite blocks that had been used as the paving material during the late 1800s. So instead of actually taking the mesquite blocks out, the paving just went right on top of it. So as they were preparing to put this flagging stone in, they were able to see sections of it. And if you kind of can look closely at the image that's on your left-hand side, you can see a gentleman who's trying to take a pickaxe to it. And there are small little blocks of the cedar blocks that were there at the time that were sitting just right below the asphalt. As archaeology work and actually other construction work has progressed in the plaza and around the plaza, we're continuing to find evidence of these mesquite blocks. They did not remove them when they repaved in asphalt. Again, we're starting to find the continued evidence of this caliche floor within the plaza area and also within the Calvary Courtyard area. And Jack Eaton had done an excavation right in front of the church during this time as well and was able to see some of this caliche floor, which is fascinating because it does date to the mission time period. If you want to switch slides now. This image coming up is one of my all-time favorites that I had never seen until I got to the Alamo. There was a box of old photographs and negatives that were just sitting around, and I had somebody scan them for me. And as I went through, I was excited to find my mentor in one of these photographs. If you look in the trench, the big blown up picture, there's a lady by the name of Ann Fox. When I came to UTSA CAR in 1996, when I first volunteered, she taught me about Spanish colonial archaeology. By the time I was hired there in 1998, I followed her around and asked her many, many questions. So in 1976, she participated in an excavation right in front of the Long Barrack. and they were trying to look at the foundation of the long barrack and just see what it looked like at that time. What I find funny is that I found the opposite photo, or opposite view of this photo, also in that box. The little insert at the bottom is everybody looking at Anne in the trench. So she's in the trench with one gentleman, but if you notice in the big picture, there's a bunch of feet up at the top of that trench. The bottom little photograph is everybody looking at her. So we'll switch to the next slide. So we're going to go on to some of the excavations that happened in the late 1970s and 1980s. And if you look at the screen too, the map should be coming back up with several different sites, project locations circled. During 1979 and 1980, there was several projects that happened during this time, and one of the most famous ones for an archaeologist in Texas is the one we refer to as the Radio Shack excavation. As far as I know, this is the very first air-conditioned excavation that has occurred in Texas. At the time, there was a building that was located just south of the current Crockett building, and it housed a Radio Shack. Instead of tearing the whole building down and allowing the excavation to happen, they gutted the inside of it, kept the air conditioning and the light going, and the archaeologists were able to work indoors and remove the dirt and soils, all that, and were able to find some remnants of some of the west walls and west rooms. I'm very jealous of that because it does get hot in San Antonio during the summertime, and so they had it. I've never been able to dig in an air-conditioned excavation before. So what is also happening too is that if you look at I think it's, so the Radio Shack excavation, if you look at your map, it would have been near where 19 is at and 11. 11 was a Paseo excavation that happened too that allowed the passway that now goes through the hotel on the other side of the Alamo Plaza at this point. If you look, again, there's a circle for 14 and 13. This was part of an archaeological field school that UTSA hosted. And what's fascinating about these excavations is that both of these happen in consecutive years. They were able to identify 1836 and 1835 battle entrenchment. And when I refer to 1835 battle entrenchment, we did have a prior skirmish, battle at the Alamo known as the Siege of Bear. And this is when the Texans took the Alamo from Mexico at the time. Shortly thereafter is when we get to the Battle of the Alamo period. So there was a time in when the Mexican army was actually fortifying the fort prior to 1835 so they could keep it. The Texan army, when they came in and took it in 1835, they continued to add fortifications to it. And so the lunette that you see coming off the south portion of the map is part of one of those fortifications. If you look at where 14 is at, this was another section of where the archaeologists were able to see a portion of what would have been the Palisade Trench. If people know the history of the Alamo, the Palisade area is where most historians think that Davy Crockett was fighting at the time. And so this would have been an open area that did not have a wall, but they fortified it with a post section that would have closed off that area. I do find it interesting that we're going to be probably trying to look at this area again in the future, because in that box of photographs, we also found a photograph of a early 1900s movie set that did occur at the Alamo, and they had reconstructed a palisade in and around that area. So it'd be interesting to see if we can identify the difference between the movie set and the actual Palisade Trench. And then the last one is over on the very right-hand side. It is outside of the grounds of the battlefield, but archaeologists from UTSA CAR were able to identify remnants of one of the old mayor's house of San Antonio. He had set up his house there. So a lot of late 19th century artifacts came out of there and kind of gave us more history of the use of the area. I'll change the slide now. So I'm going to show you some of the old photographs that we have that a lot of people don't get to see. This is a photograph of the excavation of the Paseo. And again, I believe it was UTSA CAR was doing the work under the guidance of Jake Ivey. And you can see that you're looking across the plaza, and up in the corner is the actual Alamo Church. If you want to do the next slide. Did you get that one up or no? Okay. Okay. So this next slide is actually a view overlooking that area after some of the excavations have happened. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but there's a difference in some of the colorations in the soil. And what we found here is that there were remnants of the adobe bricks that had been used as the foundations for the structures that had been located on the west wall. Now, adobe brick, of course, is made out of mud, clay, straw, and kind of packed into these bricks. They don't last very long, so it was fascinating to be able to see remnants of this foundation still there. We'll go to the next slide. This is a much better view of what was uncovered. It's going to be that one. This is a much better view of what was uncovered along the western wall of the compound. And again, adobe bricks foundations were found. There's a lot of little kind of round circular objects in there as well. These are called post holes. Those would have been used to put the wooden post for the rest of the structure in there, either to hold up the roof or for other areas that they had been utilizing at the time. And this is a kind of an overview of where the radio shack had once been. Once they had finished the excavations, they did take down the building at that time. Next slide. It is going to be a black and white photograph again. This is a close-up of one of the profiles from the 1989 or 88 and 89 investigations. If you look closely in the bottom portion of the photograph, you'll see that there is a change in color. The upper soils are dark, and right underneath it are some lighter soils. It's a black and white photograph, so it's kind of hard to see. But that kind of gives us an idea of some of the soils, the natural soils that we see in the area. That lighter soil is a naturally occurring soil deposition, and usually we don't find any artifacts in that area unless there's been an entrenchment that was dug inside of it. Trying to see here. And we'll go to the next photograph if you want to do that. Another overview of the 89 and 88. And this is where they did find the Lunette Trench. So there were quite a few of objects that were related to that very post-battle period time. Once the Battle of the Alamo was over, the Mexican Army was given the orders to pretty much demolish the site. So they went around and filled it in entrenchments, and they were told to break down the site completely. They didn't do it, so that's why we still have several of the buildings standing. But we were able to see some of the rubble of them backfilling these entrenchments during the 88 and 89 investigations. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the 19th century artifacts that came out. So these are post-battle period. One of the most fascinating things I find about the site is how many years of occupation we've had. Since 1724, this site has been continuously used. It was most likely used even prior to that as a place for the Native Americans to come and utilize the site. It was close to water and things like that, but what we can actually document fully is from that time period where the mission was established all the way up into current times. And when you're looking at these artifacts, you see kind of that 19th century, so 1850s up until 1899 occupation. Anything from horseshoes and mule shoes that could potentially pertain to the quartermaster depot, because we did have a blacksmith and we did have horses that were stored here for the quartermaster. Below that we have glass bottle, lots of buttons, lots of different ceramic types. And what's interesting, and we'll get to this, I have a picture a little bit later, is that at one point the Long Barrack was used as a mercantile store. So we do know that there was lots of different objects that would have come in and out of that site after the U.S. Quartermaster Depot. In 1995, we did do we as in CAR did an excavation along the south side of the church, and it was one of the attempts to figure out how to address the fact that the stone walls are like sponges and just suck up all the water. And during that time period, they installed what we call a Monell plate. And the Monell plate was actually horizontally installed along the base of the foundation all the way through, and really it did stop the water from rising all the way up the walls. We have found out now during recent excavations what it did is it pushed the water out on either side of that plate. So we have wetter areas on the inside of the church now, on the outside of the church, and to the sides of where the Smonell plate was. But it was an attempt to see if they could figure out a way to preserve the church longer. What was also happening at that time is, I don't know if you guys know a TV show by the name of Unsolved Mysteries. There was a drive to do an excavation right in front of the Long Barrack for the well that supposedly contained the buried silver that Bowie would have placed down there during the Battle of the Alamo. And Unsolved Mysteries came forward and said that they would go ahead and publicize this dig. An archaeologist came forward and offered to do the dig with it. And of course, it was very much like opening one of the tombs recently on, I think it was Unsolved Mysteries again. They did not find anything. There was no evidence of a well. There was not a whole lot of interesting things to find, other than we did find remnants of that late 19th century occupation at the time. I'll go to the next slide. So about 10 years spanned between 1995 and the next excavation that happened at the site. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2006 field school. I was blessed with the honor of being able to teach this class for UTSA. I had 15 students, a mixture of undergrad and grad students, and they came out every day for a total of 8 weeks and dug in 3 locations around the Convento and Calvary courtyards. It was fascinating because this has been the first field school that was dug since 1989. And so the UTSA students hadn't had this opportunity in a long time as well. If we go to the next area, I'll talk about the next slide, the different areas that we looked at. And there's areas 1, 2, and 3. In area 1, we had used some evidence from one of the previous investigations that there potentially was an entrenchment related to the Battle of the Alamo. And we wanted to see if we can find out more information about that. The other part was that the archival research had indicated there might have been a ramp for a cannon. So either way we looked at it, we felt like this was a good place to put an excavation unit. In area 2, we were trying to find information concerning the foundation of the arcade and the southern wall of what is the Convento courtyard. And we put 10 units in that area. And then area 3 was an area that had not been investigated before, and we decided to put 1 unit in that area to see if we can find any interesting information. The students were great. We found a lot of really cool information that actually didn't get published till a little bit later. If you go to the next slide, what was very fascinating is that in Unit 1, which was located on the area where the arcade and the southern wall of the Calvary courtyard met, we were able to find the foundation of the arcade. Now this arcade was built, our current arcade that you guys see today was built probably about 1917. But we wanted to see if it was sitting on top of the original foundation. And we did see that there is a shift in the original foundation and the stuff that was built on top. And we were able to document that change in our building sequence. And we were also able to document the original wall on the south side of the Calvary courtyard, or the Convento courtyard, which is original to the site. In Unit 13, this is the one that we were looking at in that very northern portion, trying to find an entrenchment or a cannon ramp. We did not find either of those things, but we did find undisturbed, highly stratified deposits. So we were able, as we dug down, to see things from the 1920s all the way down to the very first occupation of the mission here. And it was so nicely stratified that I was able to date each of the levels as we went down. And what was really cool about that too is we could see where the quartermaster depot had come in at one point and put down a new floor. We had seen some of the treatments that had been done during the mission period, and we had a very small portion of what probably was the battle period. If you change the slide, some of the artifacts that came out of these excavations, we had quite a collection of mission period artifacts that include lots of the different types of ceramics that would pertain to that time period, as well as that continuation of the Native American technology. So the mission points that we know as Guerrero points, you can see that on this slide too. But we also found evidence of either the quartermaster depot or the battle with things such as musket balls. These were fascinating for us to find, and because of where we were pulling them out in the stratigraphy, we were able to really date the deposits as they came out of the ground. The next slide is another collection of artifacts. These date probably to the mission period, with the exception of the blue glass gemstone. That could be probably 1850s time period as well. But what is interesting is the very two top objects on that are the same, or two images are the same object. They're just different views of it. And this one had me stumped for years. And I mean, seriously stumped. I could not identify it, other than I knew what kind of ceramic it was. I knew where it was manufactured, but I didn't know what the object was. And in looking at it, it kind of looked like a little flower shape, and then the portion of it was broke off. But the ceramic type is called tonalá, burnished ware, and it comes from the region of Tonalá, Mexico. And I will say archaeologists are strange. We do lick artifacts to try to test things about it. This is one of the things that I do lick when I'm in the field. And the reason I do this is because the clay gives off a very distinct smell when it's wet. I know I probably could just wet it with a water bottle, but usually it's easier to lick it first. So those are the things confirmed what type of ceramic it was, but I didn't know what it was. So I took these images around with me to several different conferences, archaeology conferences for a couple years, did a presentation about the field school until I went to a conference for the Society for Historical Archaeology, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards. He goes, "I know what this is, and I can show you what it is." And I had been looking at it upside down, really was what it was, is actually the foot of a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so it would have been a very small statue, about yay big, but what I had seen was the very bottom portion of it. So it was neat to get other people to get to see some of our artifacts to help us identify it. Underneath that, we have a piece of olive glass. It's the neck of a bottle. Olive glass is very much traditionally to the Spanish colonial period. It's where you would have had your wine. And the priest did use that during the mission period. If you go to the next slide, remember how I told you that the long barrack was used as a mercantile store? In one of the units, we're actually able to find evidence of that with the recovery of a small amber glass poison bottle. And this would have been one of the objects that most likely would have been inside the mercantile store and sold. Not exactly sure what the poison was that was being used, but we definitely knew that you should not be drinking from that bottle. Go to the next slide. So this is a photograph of the mercantile store. One of the interesting things is when you come to visit the Alamo today, and I can tell a little story about my dad too, when he first took me to the Alamo, is you realize that the long barrack is actually only one story. And when my dad took me to the Alamo for the very first time, he turned to me and he said, "I thought it was much bigger than this." He goes, "In the John Wayne movie, it seemed like it was taller." I was a young kid, and I didn't know this until I got into the grad program and I started learning more and more about the Alamo, that the Alamo was actually 2 stories tall. So when I was in my 20s, I came home one day and said, "Hey, Dad, guess what information I just found out?" and showed him a picture like this. So this is a picture of the Hugo Schmelzer mercantile store. Initially, it was a Grenay. It was called Grenay's Castle. In 1877, the long barrack was purchased by Grenay. He transformed the building to have this wraparound porch. If you look closely at the very top, there's a 1 castle turret still left. He had 3 on there that make it look like a castle, and he pretty much filled that thing with objects to sell. He passed away shortly after, and the heirs of Grenay sold the store to Hugo and Schmelzer. They kept the mercantile store. I think they got rid of a couple of the turrets, but they continue to sell objects. And in the very small portion, the small portion that's located right next to the Alamo Church and the long barrack, we found out that there was a natural history museum that was in there as well. And one of our staff has actually talked to the people that may have had some objects from there. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what happened shortly after the Daughters of the Republic of Texas obtained the site. So the Long Barrack was falling into disrepair. Okay. The Long Barrack was falling into disrepair even during the tail end of the mission period, and we know that people were trying to do some repairs to keep it functioning. But after 1905, when the DRT took over the site, Clara Driscoll and Adina de Zavala worked to try to get a hold of the Long Barrack to put it into the collection or as part of the historic site. They realized shortly after that there was going to be some major repairs and had to demolish the back portion of the Long Barrack, also as a mercantile store. So if you look at this postcard, this is actually what were the remnants of the original walls left in about 1913. Adina de Zavala lost another fight because within a few years from that, the very first story, or the top story of the Long Barrack was removed. And the DRT did reconstruct a portion of the Long Barrack at that time, so where it looks today. So, let's see what I got here. I'm going to go through the next one. If you can go through the 2016 excavations real quick. So this was the next excavation that was done. It was part of trying to gain information for the master plan. And we're at this one right now. And what we were looking at was some areas to figure out if there was still a west gate or west wall, if there was a south gate, and really how deep some of the deposits were. If you go to the next slide, there's another map that has a bunch of little yellow things on here. Prior to doing any excavations, I did a GPR survey of the entire plaza. Ground penetrating radar. So we were trying to determine if there was anything that we could see using the latest technology. If you can go to the next slide, this is what a ground penetrating radar readout looks like. And if you can see at the very bottom one, there's a little blip at the bottom that may have represented a piece of foundation of the south gate. The big yellow anomalies in there are actually utilities that I was able to locate with the GPR. So I did find sewer lines and electrical lines at the time. Not as exciting, but it was helpful for us to know where to put the units. If you go to the next slide, this is a picture of Clint McKenzie of UTSA car, and he was able to find remnants of intact adobe bricks still in place at that location along the west wall. So this is in the same area as the Radio Shack excavations, and so we had thought that most of it had been disturbed, but we were still able to find intact pieces. If you go to the next one, and the location that I was able to dig which was along the southern gate. That little blip that I had found in the GPR anomaly actually turned out to be part of an original foundation. And you can see the pile of rocks in this picture, and it was held together by a mortar. So the GPR survey did help, but I will say GPR survey does not work all the time. So, and if you want to go to the next slide, these are the two of the, or examples of some of the exciting artifacts that came out of here. One of them is a piece of a sword that was found during the excavations near the south gate. And the other ones are examples of gun flints that also came out of the south gate. And so these things we do feel like are artifacts that are representative of that 1835 to probably about the 1836 time period. What's next is we are currently doing work. If you guys are very interested in this still, there's a lot of information that I've been able to put up about the excavations that are going on at the Long Barrack now, about the church, and a couple other areas. So if you do go to the Alamo website, there's blog posts about it. But I will say this, one of the fascinating things that's going to come out of this new excavation is that this is the very first excavation we've done inside the Long Barrack, and we were able to identify the flooring sequence from the mission period all the way up until these mercantile stores. And there was 20 different layers that we found in one of the units that represent the 20 different occupation zones, and they're amazing. I also found burned corn cobs, which people don't find fascinating, but I do because it tells me a little bit about the diet of people, as well as, like I'd mentioned before, the evidence of the Mexican military attack on the Alamo during the 1836 battle. So I do want to thank you guys for your time. I hope it didn't bore you too much, but there's so much that we can be talking about in the future.
Thank you so much, Christy. again, and I've gotten a few questions from some of our listeners. The first one is, Roberto, how do you think you can overcome the lieutenant governor's opposition to telling the complete story of the Alamo and not focus only on the 1836 battle? You knew that was that was going to come, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. And, that's a great question. And that is, really important point to make, in that we want to tell this story. We want to complete this project. I think what we have in front of us is a political hurdle that will just simply take some more time. So I want to reassure everybody that we are fully committed to telling all these stories. You just heard a lot of amazing history and archaeology at the Alamo, and we've invested way too much time, way too much sweat capital, and we have a lot at stake here. This is history. This is our history, and this city is depending on us being able to help express its identity, all layers of it. And so I think that what we will have to see is that this will take some time. It'll just simply take more time than we had anticipated. We were hoping to have the plaza and the church in the Long Barracks done by the 300th anniversary of the mission San Antonio de Valero, known as the Alamo, and have started on the museum as well, have a groundbreaking. All that maybe, I guess, is best described by saying we're sort of extending the timeline, and we'll have to work around the lieutenant governor, and I think time will get us there. And we've said this, in fact, during the presentation. We said that future generations will see this as a moment that we captured now, or will just simply be something that will have to take a little more time, but we will get there.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, you talk about a timeline, and 2026 probably is going to have to stretch out a little bit, but what do you think? Can you start on any of the improvements in the meantime, or do you have to have the complete plan ready to go before you touch anything? You mentioned that the first thing was to restore the church and the Long Barracks. Can you begin to do that?
That is ongoing right now.
That's ongoing?
That is actually something that is happening right now. And we knew, in fact, that was probably the most important aspect of this entire project, is we've got to save the very artifacts we're trying to honor and preserve. And so that's underway. And of course, yes, to answer your bigger question, which was, can't we do certain aspects? Absolutely, that's what we're working on. How can we do certain aspects of this project to set the table for the rest of this big picture?
Okay.
And if I can add a little bit to that too, because I do know of the little bit of the work that is going on with the preservation of the church and the Long Barrack now, is that at this moment they are finalizing some of the placement of the sensors to start identifying water flow in the area and see how it impacts the church walls and things like that. And there is a plan on how to attack some of the next stages to make sure that the church and the Long Barrack continue to stand. So that work is going to continue no matter what. It needs to be done. Councilman Trevino had mentioned that our conservator, Pam Rosser, has mentioned many times that these structures are sick patients and we need to take care of them now. So it's a commitment that I know ATI is ready to take on, and we're going to move forward with that no matter what.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question. I think this is for Councilman Trevino also. What are your reactions, pro and con, to the Tomlinson editorial in today's newspaper?
I thought they were great. I thought it was a great commentary, and I think he's correct in talking about history, especially this place. We are a modern city, one of the greatest cities in the country, if not the entire world, and we want to do a project, a world-class project, one that we can all be proud of. So when visitors come here, they are learning something, and we are telling that story. We're not going to mismanage that. We're going to be very, very thoughtful and methodical about telling that story and expressing that in a meaningful way. I have to also agree that his comment about seventh grade history, Texas history was kind of funny, but it's also important to point out that right now, in fact, I've borrowed a couple of books from the 50s that talk about Texas history, and I encourage people to do their research, and I think that they would all agree that history, the way it was told, just wasn't factual. And in fact, it in many ways, I think, hurts us. It divides us, and was not the way we know to tell history today. And in fact, I know that people like Christy and, as she mentioned, the other great staff at the Alamo are telling a complete story, are telling the layers of history that exist, and are being inclusive of all cultures, of all peoples that existed on that site. So I think that today's commentary was a good one.
Another question about the restoration. What happens if you move the cenotaph anyway?
Well, yeah, I suspect that the political powers that be would try to create some kind of a legal issue regarding that. So, I mean, one of the things that we're so proud of this project is our process, and we have done everything by the letter of the law, and we are respectful of every process that we have to go through. This is something that we have to do because we're trying to do a project and we're trying to do it the right way. So we won't cut any corners, and we won't skip any steps. Unfortunately, the THC has denied our request. I will say this: I hope they reconsider, because that's about the only thing that will change this outcome. But I think someday it will move, and quite frankly, I think that the compromise to move the cenotaph was a good one for everybody. Not everybody got what they wanted, but this is a project that really allowed all of us to tell all the stories, a complete story at the Alamo. And so someday we will have that site we always wanted.
Okay. I'm going to combine these two questions into one. They're talking about, when did the Alamo project become the history of San Antonio project? And the next one was, isn't the 1836 battle the event that makes the Alamo a significant archaeological site? So they're getting at the same thing, I
Sure.
think.
Yeah,
So-
I don't know if we can jointly talk about that, but I know one of the issues that I've always seen is that you can't understand the Battle of the Alamo without understanding the history prior to that. And our curator is very much adamant about that. Why did the battle happen here? Why was it this location? And if you don't understand that history behind the mission, the establishment of the mission at this location, you're not going to understand why we had such a integral battle that was fought at that location.
Yeah, well, and I would just add to that, and again, this is the entire point of our project, is to make room for experts like Christy and others to demonstrate the importance of how history is so interconnected. And I think the question was, when did the history of the Alamo become the history of San Antonio? It's always been the history of San Antonio, and San Antonio has a unique place in the world, and it's marked in this place. In fact, I think that one of our major accomplishments has been to talk about all these other great cultures and how history is so important to any city. But right here specifically in San Antonio and for Texas, the way we tell history is so critical. It's so connected. I think that the fact that Christy was mentioning that, why did this battle happen? What were some of these other concerns? Well, there was also other battles that occurred, for example, 23 years prior, the Battle of Medina, just south of here. That was the bloodiest battle in Texas history. And to try to tell the story of the Battle of the Alamo and the history of this site without recognizing that 1,200 men lost their lives just 20 miles south of downtown San Antonio, and not seeing the connection to that history, I think it shortchanges us. We have to think about the fact that there was a thriving city, a city of thousands of people that were watching this battle as it happened. During that battle, that history was unfolding, but most of the township was looking at that battle, not joining in. Why was that? I think these are important, compelling questions we can all ask as we tell history of San Antonio and Texas.
Great. Okay, the last question. I wonder if anyone has ever looked for signs of the Mexican Army's bivouac sites. Is that part of your investigation, Christy?
So one of the things that I'm finding as we're doing much of the archaeology there is that there has been so much disturbance in and around downtown San Antonio that we only have pockets of intact deposits left. So I mean, we're not able to get the full picture. We're still looking for bits and pieces, and it would be interesting to see the different perspective represented in the archaeological record. So there are lots of different projects in mind that we would like to reach out and do. I know that we're discussing right now potentially excavating again inside the Long Barrack on the eastern side, because archival references do speak of an entrenchment inside the Long Barrack. The Long Barrack being one of the final stands during the Battle of the Alamo, it's likely that the defenders did go in there into this entrenchment. But we don't have any actual physical evidence of this. So we're going to move forward with that. I know a lot of people have asked about the latrines. Where would those have been, either for, the Mexican Army when they were there prior to 1835, the Texan Army in 1836, and again when the Mexican Army and the U.S. military were at this location. So there are a lot of things that are gaps in our knowledge that we would love to fill in. And really, I'm not focused on just finding one perspective. Even though it's a soft science, archaeology is one of those things that we rely on the data that we get out of the dirt to help tell us the story of what we're actually reading in the historical records.
Well, and I would add that one of the other key benefits of this project that we were underway at the Alamo is how we want to collect more information that we know is out there. As you heard, for a lot of people, they think that there's only one side of the story, or part of that story has gone forever. But we know that Mexico, for example, has a lot of that history. I had the privilege last year to go visit the flag that flew over the Battle of the Alamo, and it's well preserved. And there's a lot of Mexican historians that would love to come down here. And can you imagine having a site that welcomes many scholars and archaeologists from Mexico that can help connect all these dots and fill in some of these puzzle pieces, because we want to learn more about that history. And that is what the Alamo Project's about.
And really, our intention is to do that. As part of my job is not only just being the archaeologist on site, but I'm also working with our historical researchers and managing the collection. And our goals as we move forward is to reach out and have collaborative work with other institutions, whether they be international institutions or within the United States. But we want to work with other historians, we want to work with other groups, and try to gain as much perspective on the site as we can. Again, we're not internally, we want the whole picture. We feel like the visitor, when they come to the site, would better understand the history of the Battle of the Alamo if they knew the full picture.
Well, thank you very much, Councilman Trevino and Christy Nichols. It's been very enlightening, and I'm sure our audience, for our first Masters Leadership Alumni Association Speaker Series event, it's been a great opportunity to meet you both. And Helen Bryan is going to talk to you briefly to remind you of a few things.
Yes, thank you again. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for launching our speaker series so beautifully. I just want to remind everybody to please mark your calendars for November the 5th when we have a conversation with the former Air Force Chief of Staff, General David Goldfein. And at the end of this, just go ahead and click off of this session and go to your class social, and the link is on the email that was sent to you earlier. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us. Night.